and today I'm going to be talking about your right not to identify yourself to the police. So what should you do if the police ask you for your ID? Do you have the right to refuse to provide your name or ID to the police? So let's start with the basics. When can the police lawfully ask you for your ID? Well, in most cases, the police can ask you for your ID if they have reasonable suspicion that you have committed an offence. This is a lower standard than the probable grounds required for a search warrant. However, there are some exceptions to this rule, which I'll discuss later in the video. However, in some cases, such as if the police have reasonable suspicion that you have committed an offence, they may use other means to identify you, such as through surveillance footage or by speaking to witnesses. If the police have reasonable suspicion that you have committed an offence, they may ask you for your ID to confirm your identity and to investigate further. Reasonable suspicion means that the police officer has some evidence, although it may be circumstantial, to support their belief that you have committed or are about to commit an offence. But what if you don't have it on you? Well, if you refuse to provide your ID to the police, they may take further action such as issuing you a ticket or, in some cases, arresting you. The consequences of refusing to provide your ID to the police will depend on the circumstances of the situation. In some cases, refusing to provide your ID may result in a fine or other penalty. In more serious cases, it may result in your arrest. However, it is important to note that the police must have lawful authority to request your ID before you are required to provide it. If you are asked for your ID by the police, you should first determine whether they have a valid search warrant. If you are unsure whether the police have a valid search warrant, you should politely ask them to see the warrant. If they refuse to show you the warrant, or if you believe that the warrant is not valid, you should remain silent and contact a criminal defense lawyer immediately. If they do not have a search warrant, and they do not have consent to search you, then you have the right to refuse to answer any questions and to walk away. However, if they do have a valid search warrant, you should provide your ID to them. So if you've ever been pulled over by the police, one of the first things they'll ask for is your driver's license. For example, if you are driving a car and you're pulled over, the police do not need a search warrant to ask you for your driver's license and proof of insurance. This is because when you're driving a car, you are in a public place, and the police have a legitimate interest in ensuring that you are driving safely and legally. For example, if the police officer sees you speeding or driving without a seatbelt, they may have reasonable suspicion to pull you over and ask for your driver's license. What if you're not driving and the police want to ask you for your ID? Well, in most situations, the police do not have the lawful authority to ask you for your ID unless they have reasonable suspicion that you have committed an offence. For example, if the police are investigating a crime and they want to ask you some questions about what you saw or if they think you might be a witness to a crime, well, in this situation, the police do not have the lawful authority to ask you for your ID unless they have reasonable suspicion that you have committed an offence. They may ask you some questions, and in those circumstances, they do not have the lawful authority to ask you for your ID unless you consent to them asking for your ID, and they have a valid search warrant. However, if the police want to ask you further questions or search your vehicle, they will likely need a search warrant unless they have consent. So what if you refuse to provide your ID to the police? What if you refuse to provide your ID to the police? Well, in most cases, the police will not take any further action if you refuse to provide your ID. So when can they still ask you for ID? Well, there are some exceptions to the rule that allow the police to ask you for ID even without reasonable suspicion. Remember to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. I hope this video has answered some of your questions about when you have to provide your ID to the police.